Reporting from Arkham Asylum, this is Gotham Rogues. In this video we take a look at the comic book storyline, Batman, the Saga of Ra's al Ghul. What's generally referred to as the Saga of Ra's al Ghul is a 7-issue arc published across Batman and Detective Comics in 1971 and 1972. It's actually not a real proper arc as we now know them today, but more of a string of loosely connected stories. These tales served as the introduction of arch-villain Ra's al Ghul and his lovely daughter Talia. They were all written by Denny and penciled by Neal Adams, Irv Novick, and Bob Brown. In the first story from Detective Comics 411, Batman investigates a mysterious criminal organization known as the League of Assassins. He's led to a small Asian country where he confronts the League's supposed leader, a Dr. Dark. Dark has kidnapped a young woman named Talia, who turns out to be the daughter of Ra's al Ghul, the League's true leader, whom Dark's had a falling out with. It's up to the Dark Knight to save Talia and defeat the treacherous Dr. Dark. In the second installment of this saga, from Batman 232, Ra's himself appears as a mysterious enigma seeking Batman's aid in once again rescuing Talia, and apparently Robin, who's also been taken by the same evildoers. They then set on a journey around the globe, looking for the kidnapped duo, facing many dangers along the way. It turns out though that it was all a test to see if Batman was worthy enough to marry Talia and be the eventual successor to Ra's as leader of his organization. The crazy Al Ghul family returned again in Batman 235, where Ra's and Talia come to Gotham asking Bruce to help them in catching yet another insubordinate underling who's stolen a highly poisonous compound from one of Raz's labs. In the next part from Batman 240, Batman finally fully realizes the true nature of Ra's and his sinister goals. While trying to solve a bizarre murder where a man's brain was removed, Bruce is aided by the charming Talia. Turns out though that she was sent by her father to lead Batman astray, as they were the ones responsible for the murder. Ra's wanted the knowledge from the man's brain, who was a scientist working for the US government on top secret projects. In Batman 242, none of the Al Ghuls actually appear. Instead, that part features Batman gathering a team to help him take down Ra's and the League of Assassins. Bruce had realized that Ra's is too dangerous to walk free and too powerful for Batman to take on alone. Finally, with Batman 243 and 244, we get a two-parter that brings the saga to its climax, where the Dark Knight and Ra's duke it out to the death. Bruce takes his team to the Swiss Alps, where Ra's and Talia are hiding out in one of their bases. It's also the location of a Lazarus pit, and Batman learns that Ra's is probably a lot older than he seems. By the early 1970s, the popularity of the Adam West Batman TV show had completely vanished, and DC Comics no longer wanted anything to do with the show's campy style. Therefore, they assigned new creators like writers Denny and Frank Robbins, and artists like Neal Adams and Irv Novick to bring back the dark mood of Bill Finger and Bob Kane's early Batman stories from the 30s and 40s. One way to do that was by introducing new villains, like Frank Robbins' Man-Bat, a rogue who brought with him a dash of horror to the Batman comics. Denny O'Neil opted to create a different kind of villain, one who would give the Dark Knight's adventures the feel of a James Bond movie. With Ra's al Ghul, we got an international bad guy who wasn't restricted to Gotham City and schemed evil plots on a much grander scale than the Joker or the Penguin. He was basically a terrorist who threatened the entire world, which forced Batman to leave his comfort zone and travel to various exotic parts of the globe. O'Neil also wanted to create the ultimate villain for Batman, his most dangerous and cleverest enemy, in other words, his Moriarty. Let's not forget that at the time all the classic rogues were considered to be camp because of the TV show, so they were avoided in the early 70s. Even the Joker was seen as a goofy villain not suited for the darker, serious Batman, and wasn't used at all between 1969 and 1973. So I can understand O'Neil's wishes to introduce an arch nemesis, even though Batman already had one, or really several in my opinion. Another thing that was starting to change in comics at the time was writing longer, more sophisticated stories with actual continuity. This was also a way to differentiate the new Batman from the old campy one, as those older stories were most of the time simple one-shots. Man-Bat was introduced in a trilogy, which I have reviewed a while ago. I'll leave a link in the description. And Ra's was introduced in this 7-issue arc. Nowadays that's the norm, as we seldom even get any one-shots anymore, unless it's a special graphic novel or something. Among all the other early 70s Batman comics though, the Man-Bat trilogy and the Saga of Ra's al Ghul really stands out. I've talked way too long about the plot synopsis and the history of this arc. Let's get into what I actually think about it. So these stories are generally considered to be among the greatest Batman stories ever told. They're real classics and have been reprinted countless times over the decades since their release. But are they really all that great? I'd have to say no. No, they are not. In my opinion, this arc is ridiculously overrated and I just don't get all the praise it receives. The stories are actually pretty childish and feature some very weak writing, like tons of ludicrous coincidences. For example, when Batman and his crew arrive in the Swiss Alps, they immediately spot Talia in a crowd. Really? What are the odds? Some characters also display very unrealistic and absurd behavior. Like in the previously mentioned scene, a random woman happens to overhear the gang mention Ra's al Ghul. Well, what do you know? Turns out she's Molly Post, an Olympic skier who's engaged to a man who just happens to have been betrayed by Ra's. Okay. And it gets better. Molly just drops everything she was doing and joins this group of weird strangers, led by some guy in a pajamas, and helps them fight an ancient supervillain with desires for world domination. What? That's never happened to you? Also, in the part where Batman was unknowingly being tested by Ra's, searching the world for Robin and Talia, his idea of investigation is slapping on a beggar's costume, walking the streets of Calcutta, just hoping to run into someone who by some 1-in-a-million freak chance just happens to know something about the kidnapping. And of course he does! That right there is awful cheap writing. Sure, you could argue that Ra's planted them there since it was all a test, but that still doesn't explain why Batman pulled the stunt in the first place. Of course, back in those days, this type of poor writing was quite common. The writers and editors just didn't expect that much out of their readers. Like Batman and Talia's romance. They briefly meet, he saves her, and then they're suddenly madly in love. I can see how that would appeal to a naive schoolboy, but it's not enough for an adult. Or maybe I'm just a cynical old bastard. I guess you have to try and overlook these things when it comes to pre-80s comics. But then again, some stories from that era were written better, like the Man-Bat trilogy for example. I like to compare the two as they were released around the same time for the same reasons with the same goals. In my opinion, the Man-Bat trilogy is far superior and doesn't feature many, if any, instances of the kind of poor writing that riddles the Saga of Ra's al Ghul. The villain there is far more compelling too, which brings me to my next point. Ra's is really shoved down our throats as the biggest, baddest supervillain to ever cross paths with the Dark Knight. I mean, they really hit us over the head with it. It gets kind of annoying, and we're never really shown why he's such a bad motherfucker. Ra's never actually does anything throughout the course of this arc, except kill a guy and take his brain. The characters just talk about how dangerous and mad for power Ra's is, but we never see him try to take over the world, or even suggest a plan for world domination. He mentions briefly that he wishes to create a utopia in his image, but not how. And he also talks a few times about his love for vast empty landscapes, untouched by humanity's corrupting hand. But none of that is ever explored or really developed in this arc. We basically only get hints as to what kind of man Ra's al Ghul is. Did O'Neil want him to be mysterious and build him up for future stories? Maybe, but I think that was a mistake. For the sake of this arc, I mean. It ends up feeling incomplete and unsatisfying. But to be fair, most of the other Bat Rogues at the time were even less developed, even though they had been around for years. A lot of them were simply eccentric thieves, motivated by greed. So at least Ra's here had something interesting and compelling going on. He was a villain who wanted to make the world a better place, not rob banks or simply kill Batman. I do really appreciate that. Another aspect that's really interesting is that Ra's admires Batman and wants him to be his ally. They are after the same goals after all. It's just their methods that are completely different. No other villain had this strange relationship with Batman at the time. Talia also makes the whole affair further complicated, as Batman loves her and she loves Batman. Even though they are on opposite sides, they could never bring themselves to harm each other. In the end, I guess O'Neil succeeded in introducing a pair of truly unique and different villains for the Batman's Rogues Gallery. As for the artwork, I actually think that's the high point of this arc. Neal Adams shines the most, of course, and he did draw the really important parts, namely the story where Ra's tests Batman and the climactic two-parter. I'd say that this is among his finest work. There are so many gorgeous panels, and maybe that's because the globe-trotting nature of the stories allowed for Adams to illustrate various exotic environments, like Arabian deserts and snow-covered mountains. I also really like the way Adams draws Ra's and Talia. To make them appear more mysterious and otherworldly, he made their race ambiguous and gave them a mix of European, Middle Eastern, and Asian features. It's like they've been around for so long, they've absorbed the appearance and culture of many different civilizations. This design choice also helps the pair stand out among supervillains. Bob Brown only drew one part, namely the first one where Talia was introduced. He's the weakest artist here, but that doesn't mean his work is bad. It's solid, just nothing special. Irv Novick did the rest, and while it's not as good as Adams' parts, I still really like it. He's kind of a favorite Batman artist of mine, perhaps a lot due to nostalgia. Many of the first Batman comics I read were penciled by him. When people name the great Bat artists of the Bronze Age, they usually bring up Marshall Rogers, Jim Aparo, and of course Neal Adams. But I think Novick deserves some recognition too. His stuff was always pretty moody and dynamic, and I love how he often drew Batman's ears looking kind of like horns. In conclusion, I know I've been very harsh in this review, but that doesn't mean I really dislike this arc. It has its flaws and hasn't aged that well compared to other comics of the time, but the Saga of Ra's al Ghul is still a worthwhile read. It may not stand out well on its own, but as an introduction to Ra's and Talia it works okay. I also really like the atmosphere and mood in these stories. Like a lot of other 70s Batman comics, they've got a sense of dread and eeriness to them. So there you have it, that's the Saga of Ra's al Ghul. Remember, Arkham Asylum awaits you in the next video.